Baseball. All I know is Dodgers did not make a cut. So
so happy.
Does Houston have a baseball team, Renee?
They do, Daryl. They do. A team which is for the third straight year going to the American League Championship Series.
Oh, great. How'd the Mariners do this year?
Oh, who cares?
Hi, I'm Daryl Wanzer-Serrano.
I'm Ariana Ruiz.
I'm Renee Rocha.
And this is Imagining Latinidades.
Welcome to Imagining Latinidades. Thanks for joining us. We have got an exciting program today looking at the upcoming symposium. So it's our second event that we're hosting this year at the University of Iowa, second speaking event that we're hosting at the University of Iowa. And we've got lots of other stuff to be talking about, including just that this is the time of the semester if you are an academic, if you're a professor or an instructor or a graduate student or an undergraduate, that things are just getting kind of crazy. So,
or a baseball fan.
Or if you're a baseball fan, or if you're sick. So I'm joined today by everyone. We've got all three of us together for the first time since episode 2.
Yay.
Mm-hmm.
Yay.
Yeah.
Sound a little more excited in here.
Okay. All right.
So I am Daryl Wanzer-Serrano.
I'm Renee Rocha.
And I'm Ariana Ruiz.
And you just heard all of that in our intro anyway. So yeah, craziness of the midterm in the semester. It is just like I'm in grading purgatory.
Yeah.
I don't know about y'all. I already gave an exam that I'm finishing grading this weekend.
That's good. I get mine's due next week so that our students can be staggered during both their classes.
Yeah, I tried to do mine a little bit early and then found out that someone else in my department was doing the exam in the exact same week as me.
Yeah, I talked to a couple of students who were like, I think all of our professors tried to stagger it in such a way that they're all giving the exam around the same time. So I was like, oh, okay. But yeah, at Iowa, we're getting ready to start week 8, right? Or by the time this comes out, I guess we would have.
I have no idea what week this is.
Yeah. I mean, that sounds about right for mid-semester.
Yeah, we're in the middle of October.
It feels so close to the ending yet so far.
And before we know it, it'll be like finals week.
Which I'm like, bring it on. I'm ready. Let's just power through these next couple of weeks.
All right. Renee, you're silent on this. You don't want to power through?
Yeah, I'm fine. I'm in a rhythm right now.
Also, starting today in Iowa, it's clear that winter is coming.
Oh, yeah. I brought out the big jacket.
No,
I hate this.
Renee's in denial. I hate it too. I much prefer. I would gladly trade the scorching summer Texas summers for these Iowa polar vortex winters.
What we're doing right now in October, this is mid-January in the Rio Grande Valley.
Yeah.
You know, this is worse than mid-January in the Rio Grande Valley. And it's October. I got to deal with this for another 3, 4, 5 months. This is,
this is basically December in North Texas, right?
I'm Los Angeles. We don't have weather.
Oh, it's 70.
Yeah.
What's it going to be like tomorrow? It's 70.
Exactly.
Is it going to rain? No. What about the next day? No.
Yeah.
Yeah. Waking up with temperatures in the 30s, people would be freaking out in Los Angeles.
Oh, definitely. Yeah. Definitely.
I have a friend who lives in the Florida Keys, and anytime the temperature drops below 60, it's like mayhem down there.
That's my dream retirement spot. It's the one place in the country, further south to Brownsville, Texas.
The Florida
Really?
Keys? Yeah.
I had no idea.
Yeah.
Do you is this actually like a retirement? Now that you're a full professor and you're on phased retirement, is this basically is this a real dream?
Yeah.
Like, are you
wow.
University? There's no university in Key West, to my knowledge. So,
well, no, but if once you're retired.
Yeah, but you can fake retire.
Okay.
Yeah, Moosehead retire.
What else is going on before we get talking about? Before we continue with planning our retirements, what else is going on?
I'm 37. This is a bad subject, though.
I can't wait till you turn 40. It's gonna be so much fun. I mean, we'd have to somehow trick you into actually showing up to a party.
That would be tough.
outside of work hours.
That would be very difficult there.
But we've got we've got a few years to plan for it.
We will make
plan
you
a
our
5K
friend.
or something. Plan like a 5K or something.
Ah.
Be like, Renee, show up this 5K, and then it's a party.
Or like a semi-competitive, but not too competitive bike race.
I don't race my bike because I'll crash. I can't crash my bike. My bike's worth more than my car.
Well, especially after your battery died this week.
That is true.
So for Imagining Latinidades, this is also kind of that mid-semester period. We just finished the first of our film series for the academic school year last night with a screening of La Bamba.
How'd it go? How many people were there?
It was a fair number of people. We didn't actually get a chance to count everyone that was in there, but I'd say it was close to the 50 mark.
I think that's really great that we're having that level of attendance. We saw what the attendance was like at our opening conference, and we see what they're like at these other events, and I think it shows a lot about how sort of hungry and ready the community is for this type of programming that, on a weekday night, you can have a film screening like that and you can get that big of an audience, not students coming for like extra credit or, other things like that, just people generally interested in the type of programming related to sort of, Latinx studies that we have going on. Wonderful.
Yeah, no, it was great. I was talking to a faculty member from Cornell College. I think she came out for the screening as well. Yeah. And that's one of the things she mentioned. She was like, I needed to come out here and see this. Like, this is, I miss being in this type of environment where I'm watching myself on screen.
Yeah.
So thinking just about the importance of representation and really the fact that, as you said, there's a real energy and desire for this type of programming and events.
What was the mix of it? Did you get a lot of sort of Latino Latinx students? Or individuals, or did you get like a lot of sort of, more typical sort of white Iowan community members, or like?
There were quite a few students out, faculty members, folks that I recognized. There were white Iowans there as well. Probably not as large a number as the Latino Latinx folk, but definitely a good crowd. Yeah.
Yeah, it seemed I was just there for the beginning to give the intro. I had to take off because it's the anniversary of my kid coming home from the NICU. But it seemed like a great crowd. I was really bummed that I didn't get to stay because I have distinct memories of seeing this film in the movie theater as a kid. It was the first time. I mean, gosh, probably the only time as a kid, because we didn't go see Stand and Deliver. So it's definitely the first and maybe the only time as a kid seeing like Latinos on screen, on the big screen. And I was obsessed with the music for like, I don't know. I mean, for most of my life, probably.
Yeah, and I was part of a conversation after the screening, and that was actually sort of the way that we started off the conversation. Just because the film came out in 1987, directed by Luis Valdez. So this is like his film coming after the success of Zoot Suit. And just thinking about it as came out 87, it was something that I kind of was born watching. It would randomly come out on TV on Saturday afternoons and I would watch it. It was something that, when I got to college, really close friends and I would just quote stuff, random things from the film. And it's now, generated all these memes as well. So just all its different types of afterlives and the influence that it's had in sort of just my cultural upbringing. And this is a story of a Mexican-American musician, rock and roll star. So thinking about it as also like a celebration of Latinidad, which I think is a nice way to frame it. And also in that larger trajectory that kind of leads to narratives like Selena. So these were all conversations that we had yesterday with Kathleen Newman, who's a professor in cinematic arts and Spanish and Portuguese. And she was able to give us a lot of insight into, how it was framed within Luis Valdez's work, within Chicano cinema, things of that nature.
Yeah, cool. We still got to we need to like,
I still haven't seen it.
Yeah.
I was not going to.
We're not going to point that out.
Yeah,
I appreciate that.
I wasn't going to pick on you, Renee. See?
No, we have to pick on Renee about that. But then you can equally pick on me for having never seen Selena. But I don't think
both of you just
What? Even I
outed yourself.
I'm the bar. If I've seen it, then well, okay, all right.
Yeah, but
wait, so you have seen it, Renee?
I've seen Selena, of course.
Okay,
I'm from South Texas. I'm from South Texas.
I understand that, but I just wasn't sure.
I remember the kids crying in school when we found out about it. Yeah. She's a local hero.
Yeah.
I mean, I should yes. Should I have watched the entirety of Selena by now in my life? Absolutely. Have I taught essays about Selena? Sure. Do I appreciate the acting of Jennifer Lopez? Absolutely. But I haven't seen the movie in its entirety. I've seen clips. I've seen bits and pieces of it.
Yeah, you've existed in the world.
Well, you know what we should do? We should plan. Here's what we should do. We've got some episodes coming up that we don't have a plan for. And
that's always a good start. Yeah.
And we should watch these films finally. So I've got the DVD of La Bamba at home. I'm assuming one of you has the DVD of Selena.
Yeah.
So we can do a little swap. We can watch them independently.
All right.
And then we can.
Although, how fun would it be to see Renee watch these films in real time? The commentary would be amazing. I bet
it would be amazing. However, when are we going to find a time when the three of us can get together and watch two films?
True.
All right. We'll do it.
So this is a plan for a future episode. We will discuss La Bamba and Selena and our different receptions of those, and we will probably also link a bunch of memes and stuff in the episode, because I'm sure there are memes, Selena related memes that I'm not appreciating to their fullest, and GIFs that I'm not appreciating to their fullest, and the same can be said of Renee and La Bamba.
GIFs or GIFs? We haven't had this debate.
Oh, this is the Latinx, Latin.
Yeah,
exactly.
Yeah. This one, there's no debate. It's GIFs. It's not GIFs.
Except you're wrong.
You say GIFs?
I say GIFs, but I've heard people say GIFs.
I say GIFs.
I
get that it's a G. I get that it's a G.
I hear people mispronounce things all the time. But it's GIFs, not GIFs. I'm gonna get huh?
Yeah. So send your Twitter
hate mail to
Imagining Lat at Dr. DWS.
One other thing that we found out before starting the screening is that our next screening will be at the new film scene location at Chauncey. And that's exciting because it's I haven't been in that theater yet.
Neither have I.
It looks
great,
really sweet from outside. Yeah.
I've seen pictures and heard really wonderful things about it, and so we'll have either a slightly or a much larger space still to be decided, and that's going to be a December screening. I believe it's Wednesday, December 4th.
What are we watching?
It is going to be the film Pa'lante Siempre Pa'lante, which is a documentary about the Young Lords, particularly the New York Young Lords, created by a former member of the Young Lords, Iris Morales, who is an amazing human being, worked on this film for quite a long time because she really wanted it to be as good of as kind of good in terms of quality of a representation and a breadth of representation as possible. And she's going to be here for Q&A after the film, and she'll be on campus for that day and the day prior, visiting classes, giving some other lectures. So super excited about that. I've been at events with Iris in the past and interviewed her a number of times when I was working on my dissertation and my book, and so it's I'm excited that she's going to be coming to town. She's such a powerful presence, especially for young folks, and so I'm gonna see if I can try to maybe like get another like little interview or something on tape that we might use in the future, just because I think that her perspectives need to be preserved.
Agreed. Yeah, that sounds like a wonderful opportunity. So definitely, if you're in the Iowa City area, that is something to add to your calendars and check out.
Yeah. And even if you're like not in Iowa City, but you're close enough that you can make the drive, it's totally worth doing. So like I'd say even if you're like, I don't know, in as far west as like Des Moines and Ames, as far east as maybe Bloomington Normal, it's worth making the drive out to see the film and to be here for the Q&A.
Looking forward to it.
Well before that, I mean, before that film happens, we've got 2 more speaking events here on campus. So 2 of our one-day symposia will be happening. The next one, which is the one we want to talk about for the rest of our time here today, will be on Friday, October 25th at Merge in downtown Iowa City on the Ped Mall.
So this is a change in location from the opening conference, right?
Yep, this is our one. This is the one speaking event, of our 6 that there was a scheduling conflict at the public library, and we weren't able to have the space for the full day, and so it's basically next door. I think the building is even connected to the library. It might even be owned by the library. And it's a nice space. We've been in there for kind of a walkthrough and setup, and it's going to be plenty of space for a big audience. So I think it's going to be a good place to have it. And so that will we have the information already up on our website, which is imagininglatinidades.com. And like with the opening conference, we'll be doing a live stream, and we'll have those details up on the website as we get closer to the event day. And so this symposium is titled Latina, Latino, Latinx Migration. So tell us, Ariana, who's going to be here?
So for the Latina, Latino, Latinx Migration Symposium, we have 3 invited speakers: Maura Toro-Morn, Karma Chávez, and Fidencio Fifield-Perez, who will be joining us.
One of the things that I love about this symposium is that, to me, it kind of captures the spirit that went into designing all of the Imagining Latinidades year, and that spirit is one that what I'm thinking of in particular is marked by interdisciplinarity. And so we've got in these speakers, Maura, who's a sociologist by training, and Karma, who comes from my field, from communication studies, particularly from rhetorical studies, so more humanistic and critical, and then Fidencio, who is an artist, right, and who has an MFA from the University of Iowa. Right,
and he's currently an assistant professor of painting and drawing at the University of Missouri.
Yeah. And this is, for those of you who are like, oh, that name is so familiar. Well, it should be familiar because it's his artwork that is the featured artwork in all of our promotional materials. So the wire sculpture that we have on our website and in our podcast cover and in all the flyers that we do, that's his work. And that's a piece that I think we all saw, or I think I saw for the first time. I don't know if you were here yet, Ariana, when it was on display at Art Building West I think it was on display at Art Building West in like 2012, 2013, 2014, somewhere around there. He had some of his work there, and this piece, I think, was one of the pieces there.
Yeah, I became familiar with his work through the Center for Workers' Justice. I think he had done some stuff with them or in collaboration with them, and that's where I was first exposed to his work. And so when we were really thinking about, well, what type of image would capture this idea of imagining Latinidades, he came to mind, right? And I think we all kind of saw his work and were like, yes, this is something that's not only rooted in the Midwest and his experience here, and thinking about just his background as a DACA recipient as well, but also just the image itself, the fact that you can't really make out particular bodies, I think just speaks to a lot of what what we're wanting to do.
Yeah. So I think you're right, Daryl. The interdisciplinarity here is absolutely representative of what we're trying to do. And, everyone here, if we later we'll talk about sort of what everyone is discussing, is really thematically tied. And so they're emphasizing some different things. Maybe there's a little bit of more emphasis on the idea of migration in the Midwest. In some cases, it's a little bit more outside of that context, dealing with sort of more national discourse issues. But we're all sort of hitting at the same thematic thing. We're coming at it with a little bit different emphasis and with these different disciplinary approaches. And this is exactly what we're trying to do. And we, I think, did a really great job in the first conference. And I think we're going to do a really good job with this one here as in terms of providing that wide perspective.
Yeah, and like with the first conference, we gave them wide berth to be able to decide exactly what they wanted to talk about. I mean, we had our reasons that we were inviting each one of them, but we didn't know in advance exactly what their talk was going to be. We had an idea of kind of the terrain that it would be operating within, and so. To see the final kind of topics and titles that they sent us and that they've been working on for this symposium is really exciting. I think it's gonna be a great conversation, and I also really look forward to the round table afterward, because these are folks who've had different experiences with and connections to Latino studies, and so I think it'll be really enlightening. So let's get into this and talk about our three invited speakers. Might as well do it in the order in which they'll be speaking when they're here on campus. So that goes, that starts us off with Maura, whose paper will be titled Latinx Migrations in the Heartland, Genealogies of Belonging and Transformation.
Yeah, so Maura is a professor of sociology and director of Latin American and Latino studies at Illinois State. And she's, what she's going to talk about, it seems like it was a little bit more rooted in the Midwest experience. Ariana, why don't you?
Yeah, and really Maura, her work seems to be framed around these questions of gender, social class, as you mentioned, specifically here in the Midwest. And she's someone who's talked a lot about just her own history and story as someone coming from Puerto Rico into the Midwest and thinking about the sense of community that's created in process, and how that's also along with tension that can arise. So I'm really interested to think about how we are looking at these genealogies of belonging and transformation, and how they're very much transnational in nature as well.
Yeah, one of the things I really appreciate about her work, and I think it's a nice connection to the work of the people who were at our opening conference, is that it really is truly intersectional work. And I think that's the case for all of the people who are presenting at this symposium as well. You mentioned, Ariana, the kind of focus on community formation, and she does so in a way that really is attentive to the connections between gender and class and social mobility, and I think that makes it really kind of really rich work to examine.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of overlap here between perhaps what we saw with Gina's work in the first conference and what we're seeing here. This idea, Gina's work was also situated in the idea of sanctuary, and she was doing her work in Ohio, so we have the same sort of Midwest heartland component coming up. And one interesting thing about Gina's presentation is that there are these very, she was sort of hitting around some of these gendered aspects, but it wasn't really sort of the core of what she was talking about. And then as she was talking about, when we got into the Q&A, that's really where a lot of the sort of questions came from, where the energy went. And so now we have this sort of very natural segue into this topic, which is going to bring that stuff really into the forefront. So in some ways you have this nice evolution of that thread across the two conferences that I'm really excited to see.
Yeah, absolutely, Renee. Maura's paper is going to address, in her words, what we know, new insights, and the paradoxical nature of contemporary migrations in the heartland in this neoliberal age. And I think that Midwest focus is something I'm very much looking forward to as well. My own background in and coming to like Puerto Rican studies and Latino studies doesn't have a huge Midwest focus, which is odd because I am a professor at at a university in the Midwest. My graduate degrees are from Indiana University, which is in the Midwest. And so I've got informal personal experience with these topics and through relationships with people who I've known, but not as much scholarly knowledge about it as I would hope.
Yeah, and I think the segues into Karma's work a little bit, because if you look at sort of my own intellectual trajectory, the idea of being really interested in immigration primarily as sort of a border policy or a border phenomenon, and then coming to Iowa, I think I mentioned in one of the previous episodes, I came here around the time you had the big Postville raid and Marshalltown raid, and that got me really interested in the idea of immigration enforcement within the interior, which is, as a kid growing up in the Rio Grande Valley, not something I really care about. And so you have this idea of this sort of more interest in, that's not really me being interested in the heartland as specifically, but it's me being interested in the interior rather than in the border. And now we have this here emphasis in Maura's work, but then if we go to Karma's work, the idea of this, abolish ICE and rhetoric related to that, well, like ICE as an institution is not, there's sort of this conflation of ICE and Border Patrol that's going on a little bit here, but the importance of abolish ICE versus sort of like abolish Border Patrol, which is not necessarily the hashtag, is the idea of abolishing the institution which is disruptive to the lives of people who are settled in the United States, right? And therefore who are also more likely to not necessarily be just on the border, but people who are settled within communities well within the U.S., like, places like Iowa City or, Marshalltown, Postville.
But I think that's part of the conversation as well, that these borders are extending beyond what we think of as a borderland, right? Which is something that Maura very much brings up in her work. So she talks about like being in an academic borderland and seeing it as an opportunity for innovation, right? Research as social change. So she also turns to the quotidian, to like the everyday experiences of Puerto Rican women in Chicago to think about some of these institutional changes that can happen from the ground up.
How much of that? So that turn to the borderland, like I read that partly as just like the way in which the figure of the borderland has become kind of central to some segments of Latinx studies, right? Like, I guess what I'm saying is there's a lot of theorizing through the borderland, as a concept that's come out of, in particular, Chicana feminist theorizing, right? So, like, to what extent then, like, I guess what my question is, what's the connection between that kind of theoretical and methodological work, right, that helps to frame the various kinds of work that people do? What's the connection between that and migration as such? Does that question make sense? That question doesn't make sense at all.
It maybe does. It just can you rephrase it?
Yeah, like, so there are ways of talking about the border, right, as a kind of as something that is connected up in very explicit and intimate ways to its like geographic and geopolitical specificity, right? And there are ways of talking about borderlands as something that maps that idea onto a host of other contexts that may have no necessary or immediate connection to the border and to migration. So I guess the question is, what's the relationship between thinking about between histories of and the politics of and sociological explorations of migration, right, as a particular practice, but perhaps also as an optic? What's the connection between that and the in like I'm doing scare quotes here, the border or borderland?
I mean, the way I see it is a lot of it is framed in violence, right? And the sort of violence that can occur in the borderlands, but also thinking about it as this in-between for possibility. And so the way that I've as I said, looking at Maura's work, she has a piece that she wrote a few years ago about her experience as a tenured Latina in the Midwest. And a large part of that is framed through these crossings, whether it be institutional kind of borders that she's entering into, or in terms of discipline, or even in the classroom space at a predominantly white institution. There is this sense of tension and pain and violence, and we are talking about it at scales as well, right?
Yeah.
That emerge from that idea of borderlands that I think is quite interesting for the type of analysis that she's providing.
I hadn't thought about you said the word crossings, and that, yeah, it made me realize, yeah, that anytime we're talking about, regardless, I think, of how we're talking about the border or borderlands, it always entails that idea of crossing and movement and the kind of like flow of people and ideas through that interstitial space, right? The kind of like the trauma of that, right? The wounding nature of that. I think Anzaldúa talks about it as the colonial wound, right? Which is something that like decolonial scholars have picked up on, other decolonial scholars have picked up on as well. But then there's also there's the other part of the border and borderland, and and kind of mestiza consciousness and all these other kind of I have Anzaldúa on my mind,
rightfully so when talking about borderlands.
But that's the hopeful and the productive side of that equation as well. But that still also involves some sense of an idea of movement,
right? And on that point of crossings and really thinking about the Midwest, we have Karma Chávez, who is a chair and associate professor in the Department of Mexican American and Latino Studies at the University of Texas, Austin, who has her roots in the Midwest as well, in Nebraska. Before our symposium, she will be discussing hashtag Abolish ICE at the intersections of Black radical thought and queer and trans migrant activism.
Yeah, Karma's work, I've been reading. So Karma, as I mentioned before, comes from the same kind of disciplinary home, relatively speaking, that I do, and so I've had the pleasure of being at conferences with her for a long time, and this is her work is fantastic. So her book that is on the topic most closely related to this talk is called Queer Migration Politics. We'll put a link in the show notes. It's an excellent book that explores the kind of relationship, some different relationships between queer theory as an analytic for engaging the topic of migration, but also is anchored in these in particular explorations of things like, I'm having my students read this chapter right before her visit, manifestos related to queer migration politics, and a host of other case studies in the book. Definitely worth reading the book, and her other scholarship as well.
So I'm really excited about this talk because I think that this is a really potentially fruitful area of research. So we'll see what it's like. I haven't seen the paper yet. I just have the proposal in front of me, but this idea of sort of abolish ICE, intersections of Black radical thought, and queer and trans migrant activism. So I'll focus a little bit on the Black radical thought side of that, which seems to be sort of newer in her research agenda. There's a lot of connections here. What she's doing here is she's drawing this connection between our immigration system, our usage of immigrants and immigrant labor, the way in which government interacts with immigrants and that immigrant labor, and how it connects to the historical relationship between government and the African American population. That is a really powerful and good analogy. I actually teach an intro to politics and race course. The entire theme here at Iowa, right? I've only been teaching it for a few years. The entire theme of that course is really understanding sort of the government as an agent of white supremacy, and then understanding it through the context, primarily of the Black political experience, and then it sort of like ends and pivots with this analogy of how the government's relationship with immigrants sort of like parallels that, and actually not only sort of like in the modern day parallels its historical relationship with African Americans, but also sort of historically paralleled the relationship with African Americans in regions of the country which didn't have large African American populations and used Mexican and immigrant labor in somewhat, of a parallel fashion to the way that black labor was used historically in the Deep South. So there's a lot of connections here, and seeing those fleshed out is going to be really cool.
Yeah, there's and I think that one of the shortcomings of Latinx studies scholarship that people have been starting to remedy, I think more so in recent years. Lisa Marie Cacho's Social Death is one that really stands out to me as doing this, as being one of the earliest examples that I can think of really doing this. Let me back up for a second. I think that the shortcoming that I was mentioning, so that shortcoming of Latinx studies scholarship is, I think, not dealing well enough with the ways in which anti-blackness, right, has circulated with it, has been in contact with Latinidad, right, in various kinds of ways, right? Sometimes from within Latinx communities, sometimes in ways that are mapped onto the kinds of like racial scripts that then get imposed on Latinx communities. And so exploring these different dimensions of the connection between, on the one hand, African American political experience in the United States and Latinx political experience in the United States, but also in the kinds of like ways in which the processes of racialization have unfolded in a manner that is connected, but also that creates distinctions and divisions at different points in time. I think this is one of the key tasks of the field right now, and that people are trying to engage in.
Yeah, and so I mean, we basically have a set of relationships here, where you have a relationship between the African American community and the U.S. government, right? And then you have a relationship between the Latino community and the U.S. government. So, the African American community, the Latino community are different, and so that relationship is going to be different. But one actor there is the same. That's the government, right? Mm-hmm. And the government acts in a pretty analogous way. And so drawing connections to Jim Crow, or the other idea that she's going to be talking about here is the prison industrial complex, right? Like the prison industrial complex is trying to incarcerate individuals of color, and it's if they're African American, if they're immigrants, right? Like that's not necessarily an important key distinction from there. So their behavior is actually sort of pretty consistent across the sort of traditional criminal justice context and the immigrant detention context. Mm-hmm. And so having somebody really draw out those analogies is going to be useful.
Yeah. I mean, I think the key, perhaps maybe one of the key distinctions is the way in which, after the Mexican-American War, right, the way that Mexican Americans were racialized, right, and that process of transformation from being mm-hmm. kind of like officially recognized as white, mm-hmm. right, for a period of time, mm-hmm. To then being, then having these kinds of like already existing racial scripts transferred and being used to create a kind of a particular logic of racialization that operates outside of the benefits of whiteness, right? Which is really like, this is Molina's work, right?
Right, yeah. It's nice to, again, as we'd mentioned earlier, think about how these pieces are talking not only to themselves for the day of the symposium, but also with folks that had come in already. So these conversations of relationality definitely strike me as Natalia Molina's notion of racial script.
And so if you think about how we organized the day, we actually, I think, organized it in a really good way, because we're going to get that idea of immigrant heartland stuff. We're going to move into this idea of abolish ICE, its intersections with queer migration and Black radical thought. And then we'll move into this idea of the sort of more DACA experience, right? And so we're continuing, that's obviously something which is related to the sort of like abolish ICE enforcement experience, but, treating it from a very different disciplinary perspective. And so I think that that's a really good sort of progression thematically of the day.
That leads us into Fidencio Fifield-Perez, who, as we mentioned earlier, is an assistant professor of painting and drawing at the University of Missouri.
Excuse Ariana's coughing. She is a sickie.
I am the sickie that was referred to at the beginning of the podcast today. And so Fidencio is coming from Oaxaca, Mexico, which shout out to Oaxaca as someone who has that Oaxacan pride as well. Woo woo. But yeah, so he's coming from Oaxaca, Mexico, but he is raised in the United States. And his work is really thinking about this debate over borders, edges, and the people who must traverse them. So really, again, just wonderfully situated within the other scholarship that we were mentioning today. And he is someone who was a DACA recipient. And so that really manifests itself into the work that he produces. And again, is what really caught our attention and our eye when we were considering the type of work that we wanted to represent Imagining Latinidades.
The other really interesting analogy here is going from somebody who's talking about rhetoric and discourse to the title of Fidencio's work, which is Words Are No Help.
It's an astute observation, Renee. I'm curious how he's going to unpack that part of the talk. Like, why is it words are no help because they're too often just empty platitudes, or is it words are no help because part of what the experience is that he's had and the experience that he tries to address through his artwork is something that just that is kind of like outside of the realm of linguistic symbolization, right? This is a post-discursive turn, right? That it has to be kind of visually represented because, perhaps because he's able to better tap into the kinds of like affective dimensions of these experiences and of the kinds of transformations that he would point us toward.
Yeah, so maybe we'll have a very interesting roundtable if you can get there for the end of the day about the both power of and limits of discourse there.
And one of the things that he mentions in the abstract is thinking about his techniques as a way to reconnect with the past. And here, again, with that Oaxaca connection, it's part of like Mourning Day of the Dead, those types of even indigeneity as it may be framed within a Oaxaca and Zapotec type of background. But it's also a past that's devoid of dehumanizing labels, scrutiny, and surveillance. And so I'm wondering if that's how those labels also come into play. So that idea of words being no help as something that's tied to words label, right? So how can we think about a sense of self and self-expression beyond language?
Yeah, I'm really curious also how in his abstract he references map surfaces, and I've been looking at his website trying to figure out if he has any examples of this up on the website and don't see them up there yet. So this must be a really kind of new project for him. But I'm really interested in how he integrates these map surfaces and how I'm guessing uses and manipulates them and incorporates them into the pieces that he's producing right now. Partly because maps are that kind of like quintessential representation of spaces that are tied to the really like the geopolitics of colonialism. They're the most, almost like the most, like I'm going to say this, maybe the most like naturalized representation of power in the kind of like geopolitical realm, right? Like maps are, when I'm talking about like borders with my students and stuff, the like hardest thing to get past, and thankfully there's great scholarship on this to help us do this, but the hardest thing to get past is the idea that borders are what they are, right? This kind of acceptance that a border, that a kind of geographical boundary for a country is this kind of like, stable, natural thing, when even like we know that borders are kind of constantly being revised and contested and redrawn. And
yeah, I mean, this is even a concept I talk about in my class, right? In this sort of the intro of trying to understand the relationship in immigration between Latin America and the United States, and the integration that's there, and the integration there's a result of the border having this sort of fluid meaning across time, right? Mm-hmm. And even of our sort of immigration policy at some points not really caring about that border, and at other points, like right now, caring about it a lot and really reinforcing it. But again, that's it. There's a fluidity there across time.
Right. And so this illusion of borders as static, but also borders in the ways that they're tied to nationalism, I think are important to point out. Like, who are they supposed to keep out? Who are they supposed to protect and keep in at any particular historical or political moment in time?
Mm-hmm. Of course, maps go beyond borders too, which is why I'm really curious what kinds of maps he's using, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Because topographical maps, right, tell one particular kind of story, but maps are also just, ways of visualizing different geopolitical relations like borders and stuff, and geographic and geological features, but also like other kinds of social features too, right? We can map housing, for example. We've all probably seen these really powerful maps of the redlining practices, right? Which really help to, which are a really helpful form of map, especially in this day and age when we want to think about the kind of long-standing roots of income and wealth inequality in the United States and how that's tied to things like housing policy, right? So I'm curious what kinds of maps he's using. I'm looking forward to seeing how he brings these materials and topics together and how those relate to his own experiences as a DACA recipient, especially in at this moment when DACA's on the docket for this current session of the Supreme Court, which just opened up like in the last week or so.
Yeah, it's going to be a great day. Going to be a great conference.
So yeah, it is going to be an excellent conference. Thanks for listening in to this episode today. We'll have all the information about the conference and about the people we've been talking about posted up on our website, and we'll also put those links into the show notes for this podcast, so you can just kind of like scroll down or scroll over, whatever the app you use does to find this information and be able to read the things that we've been talking about and see more, learn more about these speakers. Additionally, we'd love to hear your thoughts on Twitter. We're at ImaginingLat for the podcast. And you can also shoot us an email, which is at podcast@imagininglatinidades.com. As always, we ask you to please share this podcast with friends. And if you're listening on Apple or any other service that lets you rate and review podcasts, please consider giving us the highest rating and leaving a review. Those things really help us increase the visibility for the podcast and ideally make it onto the different kinds of lists that help to sustain an audience for us. So with all that said, and all the begging to do those things, thanks for listening in. Please check the show notes again for the links and sites and all the other stuff that we mentioned today. So thanks very much.